webinars as part of the Roadshow across the UK. We are really, really glad to be joining you. I know that many of you have already joined us in person, whether that was in Birmingham or it was in London or elsewhere. But now we are excited to be doing the first of our webinars online. Isn't that right, Steve? We're excited to be here together, joined by some luminaries in this space on curriculum and assessment.
I'm mega excited. I think we've been talking about curriculum and assessment and all of those kind of things. I'm not going to give the game away for such a long period of time. Do you know, we are 10 years old next month. And I think it feels like it's 10 years old and a decade we've been discussing. I know on the call people say that we're junior and people have been discussing it for a lot longer. But yeah, I'm super excited. I think we've got some wonderful guests. I think we've got some people listening and watching in that are keen to maybe engage in the conversation. So yeah, it's going to be a banger, I think. Yeah,
agreed. And we have got 3 guests with us. We were supposed to have 4. We might have a 4th join us at some point. We haven't heard any different. But Melissa, if you're listening to us somewhere else in YouTube land, feel free to join us in Riverside. You're welcome to join us. But for those of you who are joining us online, please do, if you've got any questions or comments on tell us where you're from or questions you've got for the panelists, then that would be epic. And you're welcome to have a good look at that if you want to. So we are going to be kind of working our way through some ideas around curriculum and assessment and what the future of that might look like. But I think it feels like we should hear from our guests, let us know where they're from and who they are and why they're interested in a conversation about future curriculum assessment, and not just because I put their arm up the back. Hopefully they chose to agree to it as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to look at my list from the top. I'm going to go ask Paul to start, and then we'll go from there. Paul, could you tell us a little bit about who you are and your role, and we can start there.
Certainly. Okay, so I'm Paul. I am Director of Policy at Cambridge OCR Examinations. I have worked at the OCR and before that at RSA Examinations for many, many years. And I've always been really interested in lots of different roles before I pitched up in the one I'm in now, about how we get the curriculum right for young people and how we conduct our assessments, what should be in qualifications, how we balance all the different kinds of things around knowledge and skills and so forth, and how we also kind of have a level playing field so that we don't have an education system that prefers some people over others. That's really important, and we're working on a campaign at the moment to make sure that assessment is simple and accessible, but also assesses those things that are most important for young people to have and display, and that also engages them. Will that do?
That's a great intro. I think there's going to be loads to go at there. At least the fact that you've been in the space for a long time, I think, is really important, because it'll help give a longevity to this, and it's not just like this new fancy. These people are saying this new stuff. You've got some longevity in that. And talking about longevity in no place, both of them are smiling now. Who else could it be? I'm going to come to our good friend, been on the podcast a couple of times. And that is the wonderful Mick Waters. Tell us a little bit about who you are and why anybody should listen to you in this space, Mick.
Lovely to see you, Steve. Lovely to see you, Ben. Yeah, and the others, of course, but nice to be back. As you know, I've been around the block a few times in terms of education. I've been a teacher, a head teacher. I've worked in local authorities, and I, for a little while, held a role as Director of Curriculum for England. So that's my interest. I'm basically interested in schools, and obviously schools, curriculum's at the heart of schools, and that's where I work. Currently, I work with different governments across the globe. I spend a lot of time trying to help the Welsh education system, which I think is making real progress. And I work with schools, MAPs, and local authorities across the country. when invited.
Thanks,
and I've been in a school all day today.
Amazing. And you've also been doing a bit of an exciting piece of work at the moment, aren't you, as well, with the open school stuff?
We can talk about that as well if you want. Yeah. Okay.
We're very much excited to have you back. And I saw Mick just a few weeks ago. Well, it's not even a few weeks ago. It's probably just over a week ago. So it's always good, especially when he's trying to take me to casinos at late nights on a Thursday. We didn't go though, did we, Mick? We didn't go.
We didn't, no.
We didn't. And last but not least, John. I know we met recently as well, but when I found out what you had been involved with, I thought this was a great opportunity for us to have a conversation. So, John, could you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody. Good to be with you. Yes, so I'm in a school too, literally still in a school. I teach at Cranley School down in Surrey, where I have to pause to remember because I occasionally change my job title. I think the latest version is something like Director of Curriculum Innovation and International Education. I've gone through a career having long and incomprehensible job titles, and that's the latest. So I work here. I work with our schools. We have a few schools around the world now, a small family of schools, and really my interest is in what lies, I suppose, beyond the immediacy of what do we need to do to get our exam grades higher. Important though that is, I've always thought the point of education is wider than that. I came in myself to education, secondary education, 26 or 7 years ago, having previously taught at higher education level, including at Oxford, and really the thing that struck me, in coming to the classroom was the exam pressure and the way that that's constraining learning. I don't think there's really any doubt about that. I don't think it's a controversial point. And so I set about to see what we could do about that. And I got together a group of other educators. We put together a new course. Mick might remember this back from his QCA days. We ran a pilot AS between 2004 and 2008. And then the team from QCA kind of jumped on board, and we built it up into what's now widely known as the extended project qualification. I've been really involved ever since in helping build that up nationally, internationally as well, and a bunch of spin-off other qualifications as well, which have the same pedagogical mode. The aim of which is just to really say, look, there's more to learning than just passing the next exam, and we want to be able to find ways of accrediting that. And I'm still doing it after 27 years, still keen.
It's a really interesting one, and I think as you look at curriculum and look at assessment, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. I think it's always that thing of and maybe from what you just said as well, John, and I'm sure from Paul and Mick's work, it's that whole currently is the tail wagging the dog kind of conversation that people often say. We'll have opinions on that, and that's why we want to listen to you in terms of your opinion. But I'm going to go assessment first, and I'm going to start to think about future, whether that is immediate future or long-term future. What do you believe? And maybe if we go John, Mick, and Paul, we'll go back that way. Firstly, unless somebody's dying to jump in, and that's okay as well. Ben, not you. What does the future of assessment actually look like? And what is the why? Why is it changing? And also, why is it so important that we change it, that we feel? So, John, do you want to start there, if that's okay?
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. So I think you sort of implicit in what you said there, Steve, is what was drove us where we got started with things like EPQ. I mean, I remember there was a debate about whether or not, for example, project work should be a qualification, should it be assessed, would it not be better just to encourage students to do it for its own sake? And in an ideal world, maybe that would be true, but the world is, how would I put it? We're very sensitive about credentials. We're very sensitive about the value that learning has. We want to accredit it. So we felt, we do need to have some sort of assessment measure. But as we all know, which way round to go, we treasure what we measure, or we measure what we treasure, whichever way round it is. The point is, there's this washback effect, there's this constraining effect. And it's not always negative. I mean, it's a good thing if you know what you're going to be assessed on, then you can prepare for it and you can learn towards those goals. And if the goals are well set, then in a sense, the assessment pressure can drive good learning. And in a way, that's, I suppose that's my answer is, look, let's have a look at the way our young people are learning today. Let's look at the skill set we want them to acquire. And then let's frame a bunch of assessments which actually index to those skills. And that, there's been a whole bunch of research studies now that show that qualifications like EPQ, which have set out with that aim, have really worked. The students are picking up a bunch of skills they didn't have before because we put those in as part of the matrix. So, my answer would be, let's have more of this. Most children, if they're lucky, the latest research I've seen from Oxford Brookes, who've done a very good study of this, sort of ethnographic map of uptake around the country, of the order of 10% of students are getting access to this kind of thing at the moment. And that's a great shame because we know its value. We don't want it to be the case that this is just available in bluntly the well-resourced independent and grammar schools. It should be equitable. It should be there for everybody. Why is it only 10%, not 30, 50, 60%? So I would like to see it go to scale. And I'd also then like a conversation which says, look, if this is really working in terms of the skills, the capacities, the traits that we want the students to develop, why not spend a larger proportion of the school week learning in this way? That's my provocation, really, or my contention. Maybe it's not a provocation. Maybe everybody was going to agree with that. I don't know.
Perfect. And great thoughts. I think good step in. I think percentages inclusion will probably come out in regards to the access to a great education for all, regardless of starting points, and also geolocation, finances, anything else is a must, isn't it? Melissa, I'll come to you at the end, and I'll reframe the question right for you. And thanks for joining us. But Mick, do you want to go next?
Well, you asked what the future of assessment was, and where it will develop in the future. I think development's always slow, which is one of the sad things about the whole thing, really. And it's inextricably linked at the moment to accountability for schools. So you get a natural tendency towards what's measured, and that means that's a natural tendency towards what's taught. And John just mentioned a backwash. There are positive backwash, but one of the big backwashes in assessment is the fact that GCSE in some schools rolls right back to year 7, even though people try and disguise it. In some schools, it's too long a backwash. So I think we have got a problem to solve. I think the EPQs are one of the big steps forward. I do agree with you, John. It's been sort of marvellous to see it unfold. It's just a pity it doesn't unfold a bit more and become a natural way of life, as opposed to what are seen as brave schools doing it. I can't believe there's anything brave about doing it, but there we are. I think the future, though, is going to be taken away if the government awarding bodies don't get their act together, because my guess is that some tech company will work out how to organise global assessments, global tests, global examinations, global qualifications, and they will offer them to youngsters who will take them. And they will very quickly be taken up by employers and universities, and the systems in different countries will very quickly crumble. So if you want a good challenging debate, that's a good bit to start with. The trigonometry is the same in Mexico as it is in Russia, as it is in America, as it is in England. And there'll be a global trigonometry exam on a micro-credential qualifications where you pass if you can do it and you fail if you can't, and you don't have this grading system. And I think we're on the cusp of that, with some big tech companies taking over from national organisations. There you go, that's a stirrer in the pot.
I don't think it's a stir in the pot. I think it's a grenade that's just been thrown into the room, but a positive one, Joe, in the current climate. Joe, we're all for provocation. John started with provocation. Mick made it even worse, probably. John pulled out a chair. Mick stood on the table. So, Paul, how do you follow that? What's your thoughts on that one?
Thanks for that, Mick. Yeah, I mean, the original question was something around how assessment is changing or how it will look in the future. We have a consultation from the regulator that is live at the moment, if anybody fancies having a look at that. It's very, very cautious. It looks at how we will maintain standards, how we will ensure that all schools have access to the kind of digital assessment that is inevitable. It talks about limiting the number of young people who can take a particular digital or only offering digital on-screen assessments. And we're talking about on-screen assessments. There's a whole load behind what that might mean. Until, 2030, which actually is not so far off now. Now that we're in 2026, it envisages a regulated, controlled set of recognised, government-funded part of the national curriculum education system that's carefully worked through. And, I have a lot of sympathy with that careful approach, but I think we should all recognise Mick's point, which is that outside of that, already schools are investing in all kinds of low stakes maybe, but assessments or ways of assessing mock exams and so forth using technology. They are accessing all kinds of ed tech in terms of teaching, including AI teachers and so forth. So we are in a world where it feels to me like there are it's a two-speed system. I think it is very important that but I would say this, wouldn't I, that we maintain the regulated national set of qualifications and assessments that have relevance to young people that go much wider than trigonometry. That are part of our cultural capital and so forth, and that learning is it's not about every individual achieving something separately and on their own. Learning is about a community of people, young people coming together, discovering things, talking about them, and so forth. And I think we need to be on our guard about some kind of Wild West where those big tech companies come in with different solutions and so forth. And I think that there is scope for making sure that we have something that is built by the community of schools and colleges, and that is a curriculum that supports young people in a very challenging time in our history, if I can put it that way. So I don't know if that entirely answers Mick's point, because clearly there will be in the future there will be ways in which people get recognition and badges and qualifications and so forth, which is outside of a national system. But I think it's really important that we preserve that sort of cultural sense of who we are, where we come from, and that we also are able to be agile in terms of developing people's skills for the jobs that we will need in the future as well.
I can see where you're coming from, Paul. Mm-hmm. I think my thoughts on speed would be that we have to consider if there are two speeds, maybe it's not reverse and stop, or reverse and first gear, maybe. I think we often talk about in regards to anything. This is not a response just to your thoughts as well, Paul, just to call that out before I go to Melissa. I think we often consider, and I would say it is freezing currently. Do you know, it says it's about 3 degrees outside, but it's not. It feels like it's going to snow. And straight away, because of snow, because of all the triggers, because of the news, because of the media, because of what cars and everything I will say, is everybody will drive with caution. The way I would see it is our system moves as slow as somebody driving potentially in bad weather or snow. But ultimately, I think the guardrails, if you relate them to reform in terms of acceleration, should be, we shouldn't just always consider the same car, the same consideration in regards to the response to whatever the weather will be. It's a case of how do we prepare that car better to actually drive in conditions and accelerate at a speed that we actually is appropriate in what we could do in the world. So you've got people driving around at 5 miles an hour. I'm probably not explaining this well, but actually they could be driving at 30 miles an hour on the road. It's because they don't have the right tyres. There's maybe a fear, maybe a misunderstanding of conditions, and also that training expertise within the ability to drive, because it's been such a long time that we've done any other types of assessment. The challenge is we don't know what that looks like, and staff are just a very young body, especially in the UK, one of the youngest in Europe. If you consider that, they don't know anything different. They tried something different during COVID, and it didn't really end well in terms of not actually the result, how they were treated, I suppose, in terms of their assessment and teacher-led grades. So what we just have to consider, sorry, my camera went off, is all of those different things and how we can move forward. So, Melissa, I know that you're late to the conversation, and thank you very much for joining us. Maybe an intro to yourself, Melissa, and starting. And then the question we'll go back to is, what does the future of assessment look like, and why is it changing?
Sorry about my delay. I'm Melissa Farnham. I'm the CEO of ASDAN. I joined 18 months ago. Previously, I was an executive head of a variety of schools over a sort of 16-year window, but decided coming to ASDAN might make a bigger difference than being a head teacher. So here I am. It's probably the best introduction I can give. And just from a framing of ASDAN point of view, we are completely not exam based, never will be, working with Ofqual to help them understand why we never shifted and stayed in a CASLO model, I would call it. And we're still here today doing that. And just obviously I've met with John a few times before, and we're avid fans of EPQ. We've just written our FPQ, HPQ project-based qualifications that Ofqual hopefully will sign off in the next couple of weeks. And we've learned a lot internationally over the last 12 months around how they work extremely well for both employers and for those moving forwards into a university or vocational based qualification route post 18. So we're very excited about what we think can happen in the future. I guess in regards to your question and just listening to the kind of end parts of that, I think assessment is shifting. I'm afraid it doesn't matter what's written on policy at the moment. I do think it's shifting from that high stakes snapshots into richer evidence-based picture, because learning, work, society is demanding an understanding and an insight to every person's capabilities. And without that starting, we have to, as education, start to move towards that, because it can't be captured alone by exams. I'm a strong believer hybrid assessment is the key to the future. ASDAN will never be an endpoint assessment group, but from a head teacher point of view and a charity point of view, because ASDAN has two hats on, I really think the exams where there is real evidence of breadth and comparability should be there, absolutely should be there. And for some young people, it's a more fit for purpose assessment than for others, but it needs to be partnered with moderated portfolios and opportunities for young people to show that they can research, have got insights, are capable of transitioning and using information well. And I think without the combination, we're not going to have, well, we know we don't have a fit for purpose workforce coming through the system. So I think education, the future of it, has to be tempered with the edutech world that's being explored out there. And I'm just listening again to those endpoints from you, Paul, as well. And I think I caught a bit of mix around the kind of how this is going to look and firms coming in and taking over that assessment process. I think we've seen it with driving tests. When everyone passes their theory and the visual assessment of that, they're still having car accidents and have huge insurance bans slapped against them, because we know by doing something by rote in that way, it's not a transferable skill. So there are systems that could go into place and it could be assessed in that way, but I don't think it will end up purely in that way. If head teachers start to build their voice and demonstrate that there needs to be a hybrid offer, so their young people move into the future more successfully. So I think there is a shift, and I think there's some, I was calling them a few months ago maverick head teachers. I don't think they are anymore. I think they're just really good head teachers that are starting to look at this differently, but it's their voice. We won't make a difference. Their voice will, by the actions that they take. Is my belief that I think it will shift to a hybrid model once again, but it just needs some brave people to get on with it.
Yeah. It's interesting there. We've maybe got some goose head teachers and some maverick head teachers to make that cultural reference there. For those people who no, okay, just me. I'm trying to be funny. Never mind. We're having a serious webinar about assessment and curriculum here. And I think what's really interesting here is
we all got the top done. We got it in there.
I think there's a consensus amongst everybody on the conversation here is that what we've done up to now is has served us for as long, and we need to keep iterating and thinking about how this might look, and whether that is at a macro level, at a micro level, if that is totally rethinking it, or whether we're going to be cautious around it is very clear. I've put a link in on YouTube as well to that consultation that Paul was talking about from Ofqual, if people do want to have their say into that. And we would encourage you to do so, because it is about a community, isn't it? It's not about one or two people making a decision about what curriculum and assessment might look like. It's about what the people, and interestingly, the hardest thing sometimes is to find how to share your voice. So hopefully that'll be useful there. We're gonna talk about the curriculum assessment review. Obviously, in the UK, when we're recording this, just before, just a few months ago, the results of the curriculum assessment review, led by Professor Becky Francis, was released, and much of what is going to be suggested to change from 2028 and beyond, regarding what the curriculum and then assessment models might look like, is got opinions, and lots of people have got thoughts and opinions on it. We're not necessarily trying to unpick and ask the question of why that's not in, why this is in, because that was the point of the consultation before that. That's why the curriculum assessment review took place in the way that it did. But the truth is that it's going to create challenges for schools and colleges in the UK and beyond, based on what was there, what has come out from that. And I wonder whether we could, what people's thoughts are, based on what the challenges are for schools and colleges since the curriculum assessment review came out. I wonder, Mick, can I come to you first, and then perhaps I'll direct it to anybody else who wants to come to it.
What are you wanting me to say, Ben?
Just what you think the challenges are for schools and colleges off the back of the curriculum assessment review.
I thought the review was a reasonable document that gave a good overview of where we need to go, and it's interesting because it hasn't evoked too much of that sort of polarity conversation where people argue from one end or the other, feeling that they've been neglected. So I thought it was a pretty sensible rationale for where we should go, and there were some sensible things in it. Personally, I would have liked to go further, because I think, the education system is too far in the past and not looking so far in the future. But I thought it was a good document. The challenges for schools, they don't change much, really. If you're a leader in a school, you've got to get back to what is it we're trying to achieve? How should we organise to achieve it? And how will we know when it's working? Which is there and now, and it's what's there in the future. As I said earlier, the accountability regime will dictate where it goes, because most teachers teach what's inspected, what's tested, what they like teaching, what they think the children enjoy, and what they've done before. So the challenge still will be to get the essentials into the curriculum when the pressure is on to get high-level exam results under a very cautious exam regime. And if you look at the review, that the consultation that's on about assessment, it isn't talking about a very adventurous form of moving forward. So the questions actually limit the extent to which people can really be consulted. And if you really want to move it on, you've got to start looking at what's the purpose of schooling. Some of the things in Becca's review, which talk about the things children need to learn beyond the subjects of the curriculum, the subject disciplines. How do you enable children to enjoy those areas of learning, really get stuck into them, see themselves moving forward as people, and how and where is assessment relevant? And I think one of the problems currently that schools will have to deal with is the fact that many families, increasing numbers of families, are seeing schooling as irrelevant or schooling as too difficult to cope with for their children. And one of the reasons for that is the high stakes accountability regime, which starts much earlier for them. I don't want to get stuck into that, but that is a big issue. So schools need to go back to the beginning, as any good leader does, and say, what are we trying to achieve and how do we organise it? And how will we know when it's working? They're just three simple questions. What are we trying to achieve? Got called intent a few years ago, and Ofsted forgot to inspect the other bits, but they're getting there. Really start working out what it is. And then you question things like timetables, you question things like course structures, you question things like the way the day is structured and the way children meet teachers. You question things like how you are assessing them in a great big sort of trial by ordeal at the end, or whether we're trying to get children to be assessed at right points for them. So strip it back in a school, look at it, enjoy looking at it, and make it work. I could go on for 3 hours, but I'll stop there, otherwise nobody else gets a chance.
No, I think it lands, Mick. I think what you're trying to say is what's contextually right in your space, and I think that comes back onto what Melissa was talking about there, about head teachers making what matters to them, what they're trying to achieve, and then how does the curriculum and the assessment framework need to adapt to them rather than them having to adapt to it, which I think is where that went. Although that's not as easy as it can be said, and obviously from your perspective, Paul, is there anything that you're seeing as a potential challenges into that space?
Can I not exactly answer your question for a moment? There's just a thing I wanted to get off my chest. Last year we published. We worked very closely with Charles Clarke, the former Secretary of State for Education, on a report on 14 to 16 curriculum and assessment, which is called Striking the Balance, which was kind of trying to feed into the sort of CAR report that we knew was coming and so forth. And just in terms of exams, we had a number of quite important things to say, and perhaps unusual coming from an exam board. But one of them was at GCSE, there's a real problem with what Mick's alluded to, the sort of that it gets started too early and it drives the whole 14 to 16 curriculum. And I think we can see some things in the CAR report about reorganising the curriculum and making the 11 to 14 space more important. And I think that's something that schools are going to have a look at. There are some recommendations around looking at the transition from primary to secondary, where a lot of things seem to go wrong, and we have that kind of key stage 3, slightly wilderness space sometimes that needs some looking at. So I think there are some challenges for schools there. And the other thing that we heard time and time again was that there are the amount of examinations at the end of Key Stage 4, that kind of cliff edge moment where people's futures, where they go next, is being decided, all happens right at the end of secondary, lower secondary education. So at 16, the amount of time that is taken up with mock exams and the actual exams, which eats hugely into teaching time, the pressure that's put on young people who are not always as resilient as we would like them to be is massive. We did a particular piece of research around maths at GCSE. There are currently 3 papers for GCSE maths, and we discovered, although they cover different territory, and they're all things that we do want young people to learn, but if you took the result from the first exam, you could predict with 99% accuracy what their final grade would be after they'd taken the 3 exams. And we looked around the world and we looked at what was going on in other countries, and the amount of assessment that in terms of hours that young people go through in terms of formal high stakes examinations is much higher than in other countries. And I think we were hoping for a slightly stronger line from the car in terms of looking at that GCSE issue. But then what comes out of that then is the debate about if we can reduce that high stakes assessment, or we can spread it across the several years rather than all right at the end. That will help. And what we could do about making sure that there is enough breadth in the curriculum so that we can cover those kinds of things like more arts and culture, more civic engagement, more kind of getting out of the classroom, outdoor stuff and so forth. I think, although I think all of that is implicit in the CAR recommendations, and there is an opportunity, if we can all work together on the outcomes of those things and feedback on the subject by subject stuff and so forth, to look at a more relevant and meaningful curriculum. And also we are going to have to look at non-examined assessment, which takes John and Melissa have already talked fairly powerfully about how we have to value and recognise those, and that needs to come into the accountability system in some way as well.
Yeah, and that's a huge challenge for many of us, isn't it? To kind of, how do we? Well, it's hard to put it on a normative curve and on a performance table and put into a spreadsheet if they've not got a number or a letter next to them. And we all know that that's the challenge. But every school is assessing things that are not quantifiable in that way, and that's where we can try and think: should they have more stake in the whole curriculum and education system? And this is a really lovely conversation, because I think where we're going here is that many of us would hope that there could be more to this and an opportunity for this. But we also know you've got to balance that with millions of children going through, millions of and thousands of teachers that we need to support in this space, because we undo it all, it causes a problem. And if we don't undo it, that also causes a problem. It's like that difficult balance. John, any thoughts into that space?
Yeah, quite a few actually. Let me try to keep it brief and to the point. So your question to us was, what's the challenge from the assessment, the curriculum and assessment review? And I think so to sound a bit self-promotional, but I did gather my thoughts a couple of months ago and put something on my LinkedIn thread, which anyone's welcome to read, which I entitled "In Search of the Lost Love of Learning." And to cut to the chase, I think that there was a big missed opportunity here to address a question that keeps being raised systematically, has come up time and time again when people sort of step back and look at curriculum, assessment, pedagogy, the whole caboodle, and that is, are children really enjoying what's happening in the classroom? And I'm afraid, that on this metric, we're not doing so well. UK doesn't rate well, I think, in league tables for what they're worth. And more to the point, if I could just quote to you from a document that was published by the All-Party Parliamentary Group, which is entitled "The Inquiry into the Loss of the Love of Learning," published springtime last year, I think. Quotes, when learning is treated purely as a means to achieve exam results, its intrinsic joy and value are lost. stakeholders argue that students effectively learn that learning has no joy unless it's validated by a mark scheme. This erosion of intrinsic motivation is at the heart of concerns that the love of learning has been lost in our exam-heavy secondary system. So this is not in any way to disagree with either Paul or Mick's contributions, but it is to perhaps say, look, come on, we need to think a bit more here and go a bit deeper. And that some of the language which is in that APPG summary rang bells for me, because I, having been around this block a few times, remembered a report that was published by Ipsos Mori all the way back in 2012 called Fit for Purpose, when A-level reform was being teed up. And they asked, the survey organisation was asked to do a review of whether A-level pedagogy and content was fit for purpose for progression to HE and employment. And they came, the language in that report is almost identical, almost verbatim, the language that's being used by this APPG report. There's a lovely phrase that they use about learning becoming a joyless bean counter exercise where students just add up their module scores and they want to get on to the next stage of the same thing in a very utilitarian approach. Interestingly, that report also commended EPQ for breaking that mold, and I was heartened to see that, because of course that was the rationale when we set it up. We wanted to have something that doesn't just equal learning as test preparation. So the challenge, I think, bluntly, is how are we going to move towards a system that actually values learning that is guided by other factors than just what do I need to get on this test, sir, to get to the next stage? How do we actually reconnect with the love of learning? I think that question, if I wanted to be critical, and I understand entirely the delicate balances and compromises that are needed to be struck, but if I did want to be critical, I would say that should have had a higher priority in the review than it perhaps did.
Well, there's no argument from the two lads hosting this webinar for sure in that conversation, especially where there's no agency and there's no opportunity for young people to pursue passion and things. Our mutual friend for many of us on the podcast and on the has been on a couple of times, and actually speaking at one of our events up in Glasgow, David Cameron said something. The real David Cameron, he calls himself, by the way, said that education is run by accountants, and it's very interesting what you just said there, John. It ties closely into it. Yeah, the love of learning is why many of us became teachers, right, or worked in education, and therefore we love learning, and we saw that in young people. And if we make it just about measuring. And I think you've said that same thing, Paul. If we make it just about the things that we can measure, then we're missing the. If it's all just about the high stakes assessment, I think that's really thingy. Steve, I'm gonna hand over to you so that you can then maybe go to. Or Melissa, have you got a thought on that before we kind of go into standardisation conversations?
Well, just on the basis, my biggest concern or challenge I think I have around it is it's not on its own. I think it's people are looking at the curriculum assessment review, but it doesn't align to the skills white paper that was released. There'll be potential disenfranchisement around the skills white paper that comes out in the next 2 weeks, aligned to it. DWP have just released their consultation on NEET and the factors around education that is now triggering this rollout of NEET. So there will be a policy or a structure, a scaffolding that's going to come out of that consultation in the next sort of 6 months. And then obviously there's an Ofsted framework that's come through. So I think my biggest concern around it is we've only got 2.5 years now, because it's September 2028 it's supposed to come into play. All of these other environmental factors, I would call it, they're going to be the challenge. And that's before you even get to the huge outfall or retention issue around the loss of professional identity by teachers at the moment, which is completely, as John and Paul, everyone's pointed out, the professional identity crisis is huge within the teaching workforce at the moment. And, you know, they didn't come into it, as you said, Ben, for the reason or the processes they're having to, but how do we carefully support them in this transition phase, if there is one to come? Let's all hope there is, but if there is one to come. And obviously from a personal and an ASDAN point of view, how do we make all this transition without widening inequality? Because whilst there's a big thing around inclusion, and I'm saying thing, because that's what it feels like. It's a thing, like a new clothing design that might happen for a while, but is it actually going to happen and stay in fashion, or is it going to follow the cycle that it always does? I don't know. That's what I would say, Ben.
I've got so much to say, but I've got 4 wonderful guests, so I just need to forget myself for a moment and just focus on what we're here to do. And I think it's really interesting that as you consider everything and the points that people have made, some similar, some different, which is absolutely fine. You know, positive candor and conflict on this conversation is why we are here. You know, we will manage disagreements, but that's okay. That we can still like each other and still be happy, and you know, have a conversation where we just disagree. Imagine that in the world right now. But just to kind of put some bits in there as well, I think a long time ago, we had Valerie Hannon on the podcast, and we talked about the purpose of education. And really, even if within the 6 of us, and if you scale out to everybody's watching and you scale it out further and further and further, really, you probably, does anybody know what the definition and really the purpose of education actually is? You know, we talked about the love of learning. That education in the UK and England really has lost sight of itself in some regards. We've not really had a clear rudder and everybody coming together to say, no, this is this, because during COVID it was send the children of the workers back, because ultimately it's key, and it became a focus on childcare, and then all of the different things. And we talk about the measures of and the grading and all of those kind of things. And we've had people on the podcast because we want to bring different visions. And somebody said, no, well, we don't do that. Don't focus on fun of education, because that'll bring back the edutainment crowd. And I was like, I think I've just been sick in my mouth a little bit, I'll be honest. Like, ultimately, learning should be fun. I've got a 5-year-old, soon to be 6-year-old daughter. I've got a 4-year-old son. And I just think, you know, I drive everything to what would they want to do. I always talk about Ella and her ability to be curious and impatient and all those. The world right now, even with us on the call, for the children stepping into it, it's so different. They are impatient. They don't understand weight. They don't understand the time scale that things take. And we talk about all of these changes in years. And I go, so when this changes, Ella might not even be in primary anymore. And it panics me, because I just think we're taking a risk by not considering and by stepping in too quickly, but we're also taking a risk by stepping too slowly for those children that are lost and are not engaging, and it's not fit for purpose and hasn't been for such a long period of time in mind. But I'm going to just climb, I think, soapbox. I think I've just put 6. So I'm just going to climb off the top 3 and step back into a consideration of potentially. We talked about the assessment and the future. We've then talked about the review and the challenges. But also one of those things is actually, how do we balance? There will be standardization. We will take national curriculum, we will changes en masse across the board, will affect hopefully all. But actually, how do we balance that from portability, recognition, but also the personalization in context, not just drill it down to the real micro level of each learner and that personalization of learning, but also even just each school, each classroom, each school, each trust is a very, very, very different context. How can we create something, and how do we balance it so that we give them something that is wonderful, shiny, and fit for purpose, but they can magpie, steal it, and take it back to their nest, but apply to what really builds those wonderful places that are individual schools, serving communities and serving the young people that are within them, rather than a one-size-fits-all model. And I'm going to come to you, Melissa, first, if that's okay, and then we'll start backwards. But what's your thoughts on how do we balance that in regards to that personalisation?
I think, and Mick very kindly came and listened to me blunder on the other day about some of this, that I think we have to be really careful with it. And I think we should standardise the standards and the quality assurance, but not the learning journey. I think it has to be contextualised, going back to the world of CSEs, which I learned very recently about, thank you, Mick. That kind of whole space needs to be really looked at. So I think that there's a way we need to think at how do we use moderation as a bridge rather than a standardization, because no 2 pieces of work should be identical. If we're evoking and developing a learner's passion in learning, a workforce that can think for themselves, nothing should be purely standardized. So I think And that can happen obviously really well, even through exams and endpoint assessment, because there's, you know, the teams that do all that marking and all that work, which is where AI does concern me, that the nuances will get lost if we go down that route. But it might be a risk we have to take because the world's gone that way. But I think there's something really around making sure we have got, you know, the curriculum assessment review that brings through a clear scaffolding for what needs to be taught, implies how it could be taught, and gives some options on how it could be taught. I think that's what we need. But what we don't need is a blueprint that's put on every school, every type of learner. I have big worries around equality, that we get to a point where there's going to be training, which I'm sure will be magic and wonderful for teachers around special needs, but actually being taught about what does it look like for an ASD learner in a classroom. That's not a theory. That has to be something they can use and adapt. But it's the same with that mainstream learner who's got those 3-hour maths papers for them, or 30% less time, whatever it happens to be, that they still have a moment in time and could have had a bad day. So how are we really going to look at it? So I think moderation has got to be a really key thing that supports the standardisation that we want. It's got to be portable, it's got to be recognisable to a workforce outside of education as well as educationists. So I think we need to think better in that way and get back to the old ecosystem communities used to have with schools, with education, and feel comfortable with it.
John?
Gosh, there's a lot here, isn't there? I mean, I think the word for me is autonomy, actually. Paul's not going to like this bit, but I'm a senior examiner with many years experience, so I'm not going to start questioning the need for standards at all. I'm professionally committed to them, but I also think that a well-designed assessment shouldn't depower either learners or teachers or schools. And I think the problem we've got is that we've ended up in the pursuit of, a standardized system, which has led to it's a familiar argument, isn't it? It's just led to curriculum narrowing, where we all sort of end up. I remember the days of the good old Science 81s, where there were basically 3 experiments you could do to meet the criteria. In physics, you had to roll something down a slope, and in chemistry, you had to sort of put calcium carbonate into acid, and in biology you probably had something that produced bubbles, and that was it. Every child in the country, their science skills were assessed on the same 3, because there were so many criteria and they were so prescriptive, there was no autonomy left. I think people respond well if they're trusted, and I think that element of trust is something we could recover in the system. Trust in teachers, trust in their professional judgment. I've worked with many hundreds, if not thousands, of teachers over the years, and I'm not saying it's trust full stop. Obviously, there's quality assurance, there's careful scrutiny, and checks and balances are built in at every stage. But the fundamental basis is, if you trust teachers, then actually, we do, as professionals, we know what good quality work looks like, and we share. It comes that shared standard emerges through processes of scrutiny, moderation, collective sampling, and all the rest. So, and the key is that when you've got that, and you've got that confidence that you've got a standard that is shared amongst, and a shared understanding amongst your assessment workforce, then you can free people up to be autonomous. EPQ is pretty much as far down the end of the spectrum as you can get away from the one size fits all, because every learner chooses their own question. And it works. We've got a robust, tested, accredited system where there is, in a certain sense, no standardization at all, at least of the questions that get selected, because every learner chooses for themselves. But they are working to a shared set of criteria. And I think, that understanding how that works, I feel over time, and I hope over the next few years, that the experience that the community of assessment that works in that way has had, and obviously this is the same model for vocational technical qualifications, I hope we can infuse more of that across the whole workforce, because I think that would be hugely beneficial for teachers to begin to discover that they can be trustworthy assessors, and that their judgments actually have some weight and validity, and that therefore there's a degree of freedom to recontrol, in a sense, the assessment and curriculum learning journeys.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Paul?
Me okay, that's better. I thought it was on mute. Right. Yeah, I might stray into some dangerous territory here. But I mean, firstly, there is a difference between the learning journey and the assessment. We must build qualifications that firstly lend themselves to be taught in ways that are relevant to the young people and their kind of their background and their experiences and so forth. And sometimes I think if you look at some of the qualifications that we have on the stocks at the moment, they kind of alienate certain groups of people. It should be the case that everybody can engage and see their own story in the things that they're learning and see how the kind of role models, whether they're scientists or painters or whatever, that are not all just kind of sort of dead white men from the last century or whatever. There's all of that needs to be thought about. But at the end of the day, I still would argue very strongly that you can have too much of a good thing, but a limited number of standardized, examined assessments can deliver equitably opportunities for young people to show what they know and what they understand. I think we also need to be just a little bit careful about saying that exams are, some kind of like pub quiz where you just spew out things you know. They are quite sophisticated assessment instruments, and they do ask people to think about stuff and explain and reflect, and it's important to recognise that. But then I was going to kind of go on something about the non-examined assessment or the moderation or whatever. John painted a very good picture, but he did say earlier that the EPQ is only taken up by kind of 10% of schools, and they tend to be the schools with a little bit more resource or bravery. I don't know what it is.
I should have. Sorry, Paul. If that's what I said, I misspoke. 'Cause it's widespread in schools, but it's 10% of the students, the cohort. That's only a fraction. Sorry,
right.
That wasn't
okay. So either young people are not engaging with the opportunity, or it's easier just to deliver it to a certain part of the cohort, which, whatever the phenomenon is, there is an issue. And I'll go back to the striking the balance report I talked about when we polled teachers in all subjects. They said they did not want any more non-examined assessment, except for English, which is kind of interesting. But most subjects, because of the burden of standardization and moderation, getting to that point where everybody has a collective view of the standard. Now, I think that's because we're doing it wrong, to be honest. But nevertheless, we were talking about the challenges facing schools, and to show some empathy with the kind of the hours that they have to work and the various things that they get pulled into different directions. The recruitment of teachers and retention and keeping the workforce motivated. There are huge challenges, so we need to go very carefully towards what I think is a golden prize of other kinds of assessment that reward, and engage young people that are not examine based. I think they're really important, but it's quite a challenge. And I think there's some work to be done yet, particularly in the kind of regulatory controls and the accountability measures and all of that, to find a way forward on that. I suppose the one thing I would say, if we go back to the point about personalised learning, is the thing that protects non-examined assessment from the kind of, well, it's just work that they could get ChatGPT to do for them or so forth, is to make them, as John said, they write their own question. It has to be individual to them, although we might be assessing something that is a generic mix of skills that we want all young people to have, whatever it is. That opportunity to do something that is independent, that interests the individual learner, is a really important aspect of that kind of more practical based assessment.
Agreed. And I think, to be fair, we could take this conversation around standardisation and personalisation and probably make that the whole conversation, because I think it's really important that we do have that personalised approach. I love how you differentiated there between the learning journey and then the assessment of that, because assessment is obviously part of the journey, but then the formalised piece at the end. I think it takes us nicely into this next piece, which I know that Melissa will definitely be keen for us to dig into, about the tension between what traditional qualifications will measure and then what then employers, universities' next steps are going to be wanting, and whether there is some tension in there. Melissa, what are you seeing tension in that space? And if so, maybe what do we need to do?
I think that there's two tensions. There's one around the drive that schools and post-16 are having to work through a Progress 8 space still. And then, we know, and John will know, our EPQs are they attract UCAS points. So does our PEQ. So do the other qualifications that are Ofqual regulated do carry UCAS points. And the reason that the universities are so supportive of our development around them is because what it is doing is supporting young people who have a breadth of learning style and capability. And I think that's the really important bit for us around the university and the further learning opportunities, but actually from a workforce and employer perspective. So talking to people like Hayes and British Airways and some of those bigger businesses, as well as localized SMEs that we talk to through some of our schools, they're looking for the same things. They want to know that young people can work under pressure. We know that that the biggest reason for people being out of work across the UK is low mood and an inability to engage. That's a terrifying fact. If you look at the community across the UK, that is the biggest reason for not working. And I'm not saying, obviously, humans are humans, and different things happen in people's lives, etc. But we also know the same conversations happening around young people not accessing school and needing to be taught at home, for example. It's the same thing. It's low mood. We then go into the mental health conversation or depression conversations. And yes, there is obviously a percentage of learners and adults that are, unfortunately in a position where those things do really affect them. But the low mood, I know I can get into a low mood because I'm overwhelmed. And what we're doing is we're not equipping future generations to be able to be resilient, it sounds like a really cutting, the whole character building statement that I definitely used to get said at me all the time at school, but it's not around the bullish character building. It's having a breadth of way of working, reacting and learning is so important to all of us. So I think in regards to the kind of the biggest tensions that are sitting there, the Youth Voice Census this year told us what the biggest tension was, where you've got over 80,000 young people who have completed at that kind of 18 to 23, I think was the age breadth, that are saying we can't get jobs like our parents used to because we're de-skilled. That's a terrifying voice to come from the youth of today. The youth of today, I felt like my grandma suddenly, the young people of today. And I think it's a real concern for us that employers are saying it, teachers are saying it, and so are the learners. There could be some truth in the matter, couldn't there? So I think the tensions are coming from that triangulated kind of visual that I kind of given myself there, that we just need to look, and I just wrote in the chat, the credible comparability. I think exams absolutely have a place. Project-based assessment moderation has a place. And the reason they work well together is we have to prepare learners, the moment for big things that happen, for drawing everything together and delivering it in a timely manner during a closed period of time, potentially meeting deadlines. We've got to be able to prepare people for be able to deliver in that way, but equally we need to prepare them to consistently be moderated, because at work we are consistently moderated, and we stop and we review what we did in a task and we go back and do it again, hopefully better or maybe worse sometimes. But that's why I think the hybrid combination is right. And universities are talking about the dropout rate is high because these young people are coming to them not prepared to know how to learn. And I know that from my own daughter after her, hopefully she's not listening, doing her A-levels and her GCSEs. University's was a minefield in year one, because suddenly she's been given a title and her own scope to think about it. It's a mind blow straight away, isn't it? Because they're not equipped in that way. So the hybrid combination is what employers want, universities want, I would want for the young people as they're coming through education now.
Yeah. And Mick, where do you maybe see any tensions there?
Well, I was going to say, in answer to the last bit, when people were talking about moderation, and that one of the things I think we've really got to start thinking about is how we stop treating a whole cohort of children as though they were the same. The very fact that everybody has to do the exam on the same day leads to everybody being channeled in the same direction from a long way back. And, you know, is GCSE, for example, that builds up to this massive crescendo, is it really that important, given that we now all stay at school till we're 18 and 19? We've got this thing that we've had since the late 80s. Youngsters take exams so that almost every minute of every day is full of preparing for these exams, with this awful spectre of this results day in the August afterwards that hangs over some children from a long, long way back. And maybe there's something we can do to enable youngsters to think about crafting their own route to qualification that makes sense to them, guiding them through qualification, helping them to work out whether they should be doing longitudinal study, project work, where they do things that are exam-based as an endpoint, and so on. And employers would be more grateful to receive youngsters who could think for themselves and plan for themselves and organise themselves with advice than they would with these youngsters who turn up with a packet of A-levels or a packet of GCSEs. Universities, as Melissa just said, are sort of worried about the fact that youngsters drop out early. And one of the reasons for that is that for many, many years before that point, they've almost been orchestrated through the exam system rather than through growing up. We're running schools around an exam system rather than running schools around the purposes of education, which earlier we said we've never defined statutorily in this country. So there's something really important about giving schools proper autonomy, not autonomy over a couple of chunks of the jigsaw, but real autonomy to sort out what matters for their schools and their children in their community. And as I said earlier, the more and more children walking away from the system, more and more families losing hope with it, unless you really sort it out and move forward. And not talking about in 5 years' time and 10 years' time. I mean, Paul mentioned transition's an issue. The first report on transition from primary to secondary was 1981, the Oracle study that looked at the gaps that children experience. And here we are, all these years later, saying transition, oh, there's an issue. Now, come on, we're a system that's supposed to be doing the best for children, not wondering when we might do it. So we need to get on with it. Sorry.
It's okay. Right. It's a good way to move on to the other bits. I think it's really, really true. Did you say 80s, early 80s, and you think, wow, it's not that long ago, Mick? And then you realise I was born in 83 and I'm really, really old now. So it actually was a long time ago. So you look back, it's that thing of, wow, it was about 20 years ago, and you go, 40 odd? Oh, wow. Okay, so we just glass here, or maybe it's been likened to putting £5 of petrol in and trying to move an oil tanker and turn it round. We do move at a pace, I suppose, at times that is slow for some, okay for others. I'm going to move it on to something that is really probably accelerating and is going to going to shake some bits up as well. And that thing of, Paul, I'll probably come to you first on this one, because that thing of global ed tech and all of those kind of things is potentially going to change some things, which is scary for some, okay for others. But what are your thoughts on digital credentials, micro credentials, and whether you feel that see them as a complement or a threat to the traditional qualifications and things that we've done for such a long period of time?
Well, not a threat. I think I've already tried to articulate some of the problems about an exam system, particularly at GCSE, that takes over everything. Yeah. I'm on the kind of Becky Francis scale of things, that we can scale these back and we can reorganize them within the curriculum, but we need to find a broader curriculum where we are sure that there are other things that people are learning, and but yeah, we've got to get on with it. And some of those things around that are not extracurricular, but things like oracy, or I don't know, even financial literacy, ability to hold a debate and understand and have empathy with a different point of view, to notice when somebody is spinning you a yarn. Oh, there's a whole load of things which are part of the curriculum anyway, or should be, and could come out of things like English, if English was a better designed qualification, or out of maths, if we were talking about financial literacy. There's loads and loads of stuff. But I think there's still plenty of opportunity for those things to be recognised separately in a relatively low stakes way. I don't see that as a problem. I do think that so in the post-16 consultation around V levels and so forth, there's a load of stuff about 16 to 19 programs of learning, and they talk about non-examined content that should be in a program of learning. And I wonder sometimes whether unless there is an opportunity through some kind of badging or credential, or through a certificated national qualification, that some of those wider skills should be recognised, because actually young people, we know from experience, will vote with their feet often, and maybe that comes back to the EPQ as well, unless they can see that they're going to get some reward or recognition, which would motivate them to follow a particular project or develop a particular skill or interest in an area. So what am I saying? I think we have to find ways of rewarding broader achievements, and there is a history of different kinds of certificates and awards and so forth that are not your high stakes qualifications. We could go micro with lots of small things. I don't see that as anything other than supporting a curriculum that includes exams. If you were going to argue that we should have those instead of some formal national qualifications, then we might have a different conversation.
Maybe for another day, Paul. Maybe for another day, and maybe face to face over a coffee, or a hot chocolate or something. John, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, so actually, just as Paul, I agree with Paul. I think it's not either or, and I think we've got to widen the lens. Actually, just to wind back 15 minutes to where Paul was talking about his survey that he did with Charles Clarke and the data that you got from that, Paul. It's interesting. There's quite a striking contrast with the data that came in, not within the actual curriculum and assessment review summary document itself, but if you read the supporting evidence that sits beneath that, it's quite striking, and it's striking because it's quite univocal as you get towards the end, sort of questions 30 onwards, when essentially the question is posed: should we widen the lens beyond exams as the principal form of assessment? And the answer is yes, 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 and yes. Question after question after question, a widespread consensus emerges in which people say, look, we need to widen the lens. We want projects, we want portfolios, we want interdisciplinary learning. It's striking, and I say it's particularly striking because, of course, the curriculum and assessment review, the car kept the brakes on precisely that point, perhaps for other reasons. But I have a linguistic problem as well. Paul or Mick may know the answer to this question. I want to know who came up with the essentially negative phrase non-examined assessment, because it's a negative way of describing something that's very positive. So anyway, I'm going to suggest we invert it. I'm going to suggest we call exams inauthentic assessment, because nobody spends any time, apart from when they're in an exam hall, writing at length with pencil and paper in absolute silence for 3 or 4 hours on a hot June afternoon. It's very inauthentic, and we're going to call the rest of assessment authentic assessment. Okay, so from now on, let's invert, shall we, that essentially negative designation of coursework and projects and the like as non-something or other, and let's call them positively what they are. They're authentic. They're authentic because they begin with questions and challenges that belong in the real world, and ideally, in my view, questions and challenges that learners ask themselves, because then they're intrinsically motivated. But they're also authentic potentially in another way, and that is, of course, that they're open, much more modally open than an exam is. You can write, you can dance, you can sing, you can perform, you name it, you can do it, and you can track it on paper if you want to be analog, or you can track it digitally. And it interests me that we're having to start the debate about the digitization of assessment. Well, those of us who've been doing projects have done them digitally for years now. And dare I say, the logistic challenges of digitally assessing, if everybody has to do GCSE biology on one afternoon, I think may never prove solvable. But the opportunity to do a digital assessment in biology in a just-in-time, flexible, digitally credentialed, microscale way is there already. So for me, the key, I've had A word, autonomy. We need to restore autonomy to the profession as assessors. My other A is authenticity. Let's make the assessment system much more authentic, because dare I say it, if it's more authentic, it will also be more AI proof, because it's not going to be so artificial. So yeah, I'm echoing what Paul says and maybe going a little beyond it, and us adding another mischievous provocation because we've only got 10 minutes left. But I don't like NEA as a terminology at all.
Okay. Thanks, John. Melissa?
Going back to the micro-credentials, I think I've been talking to our internal team around, is it currency or confetti? And us making some decisions around what it can be used for effectively. And I think, John, you were just saying about those just-in-time skills, that it would be very good around looking at targeted, and obviously the young people we work with and some of the ASDAN-based work and the challenges and modules that can happen are just-in-time kind of hooks to get learners back engaged and moving forwards before they go on to the more assessment-based work. So I think we've been micro-credentialing for the last 35 years. It's just got a new fancy name now, hasn't it? Basically, but I think that there's a huge risk that if there's too many badges, too many credentials, it's got unclear meaning and will lose its validity. And then I think that's a huge compromise. And I think from an equity point of view, it does concerns me around that kind of social capital and the kind of curating of credentials that, young people with more a broader way of learning and find endpoint assessments complex. They collect thousands of badges, which is a really typical thing that happens to marginalised learners. They get all the sticky notes and all the stars, but they never get to the endpoint outcome because they fell at the last point, but they've got a great sticker collection going on. So it's just making sure we're not just transferring one thing into another. So I think they're really important. They should have that credible comparability again, but they need to be used wisely and well and not as an excuse for those that can't. And that worries me, that they could become a a kind of lip service. And well, you did get those 3. It's a shame you couldn't quite do the final assessment, but you had a go. It shouldn't, I'm worried they will be used to manipulate those learners, that 9 to 11 GCSEs is not a game they can play. So there still needs to be a balance, but they will have their use, or they'll become confetti.
Thanks, Melissa. Mick? You're on mute, Mick.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. It
Yeah.
is.
I love John's thing about inauthentic. The more we talk about the current exam regime being inauthentic, sitting on a hall, writing on a desk for a couple of hours with a pen, the quicker we might get onto really authentic assessment. Exams have always been set by people who are trying to sort the best from the rest. They aren't really bothered what happens to what comes below the best. It's always been the system since exams came in. And I think there will be a massive change. I think if we're not quick, the education system, as I said at the beginning, will lose the authority, because some big giants will start to offer global exams on micro-credentials. And you're right, Paul, trigonometry is not the only thing, but there's plenty of things that you can do on micro-credential, and I'm sure that that'll be it. They'll put them together and create global awards, global qualifications, and running along with a little English GCSE will count for very little. And stuff like social capital and cultural capital are really, really important, but the number of children I know who study Shakespeare and never want to see it is just so saddening. So there's more to exams than jumping through a hoop to prove you're right, especially when you think they're not going to get you very far.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important element for us to jump onto, is that we've got to ensure that even if we do keep exams, even if we do keep micro-credentials on top of that, even if we do shorten exams by 10%, because that's solving the problem, that obviously that'll solve the problem. Not being cynical in any way, shape or form at all, you know me. But whatever we do with it, we've got to acknowledge that this is, young people have got to understand why they're doing it and see a point of it. And I think that's the same with the curriculum. It's the same with any assessment. Like my daughter, and I'll finish with this anecdote before I wrap. My daughter's 15, and yesterday afternoon she was revising penicillin for the history of medicine piece, right? And she was, Dad, did you know this? Did you know that actually it's a really good, and like I'm not interested. I don't want to say it quietly because she's in the other room. I'm not interested, but she loves it. And I'm like, this is what we're talking about. She can see the point in why she's learning it. She's working really hard for an assessment. She's come back today and told me how she structured a question. And I think, brilliant. That is exactly what you wanted to do. But it's because she's got a vested interest in it, and she can see the purpose of why she's being assessed in the way she is and all the other bits that go with it. That's part of what we're talking about here. And I think whether that's an EPQ, whether that's an exam, whether it's a micro credential, whether it's an online test, it's about building that understanding and a purpose, coming back to that word again, of why you do what we do. We are coming towards an end here, and we've had a fantastic, this has been I'm going to use Steve's phrase when we're on the podcast, which is we could have talked all night, and I'm not going to keep everybody all night, but I genuinely think that some of these conversations are just wonderful. The fact that we've got variety of viewpoint, a variety of history of seeing what's happened before and what might work, an expectation of what this might work for young people, and the demands on schools and awarding bodies and all the other bits that go with it. So we're really grateful to all four of you for joining us on this first of our Roadshow webinars. We are going to be going live with a few more very, very soon. We've got our in-person in-person roadshow in Glasgow on the 2nd of February, if you're still watching this. And then we've got others in Belfast and Cardiff. So please check out edufuturists.com/roadshow to find out all about that. But our next webinar it's going to be an interesting one, I think, on February the 25th. Not that this one wasn't interesting. This was really interesting. But February the 25th, same time, 4:30 till 6, which is going to be with unions and professional bodies. We've got some exciting people that are going to be joining us on that to think about how does that work in the future of education? So thanks so much, Paul, Melissa, Mick, and John, for joining us on the webinar today. And if you are listening to this and you're watching it live, thank you for joining us and for throwing your questions in. I know we haven't got loads of time to answer all them questions, but we do appreciate everybody's attendance. So thanks, everybody. It's been wonderful. Appreciate it.